Hey everybody, welcome back to the Maple Grove Scripture Reading Podcast. So last time we finished out Job chapter 24, which was the second half of Job's response to Eliphaz. In that response, he described the murderer who rises at dusk and kills the poor, or the adulterer who waits for the cover of darkness and tells himself, no eye will see him, or the thief who cases houses in the daytime and then breaks in at night. All of them were rebels against the light. Well, then Job turned to his friend's claim that the wicked are swiftly swept away, like snow melting in the heat, forgotten, devoured by worms, broken like a tree. But he pushed back on that. They die? Yes, he says, in Sheol eventually, but they end up like everyone else. They die like everyone else. There's no dramatic thunderbolt or public reckoning. They're cut off like an ordinary head of grain in an ordinary harvest. And he closed with a direct challenge. If I'm wrong about any of this, prove it. Show me where. And that challenge didn't get an answer, because what we've got next is the shortest speech in the entire book of Job. It's not a chapter that got trimmed down. It's not a section that just feels short and brief. The whole thing is just 6 verses, and that's it. So let me read it. It's Job chapter 25. Then Bildad the Shuhite replied, dominion and awe belong to God. He establishes order in the heights of heaven. Can his forces be numbered? On whom does his light not rise? How then can a mortal be righteous before God? How can one born of woman be pure? If even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes, how much less a mortal who is but a maggot, a human being who is only a worm. So before we get into what Bildad says, it's worth looking at what it means that he says so little. The book of Job has been structured as this formal dialogue. You've had 3 cycles of speeches, each friend taking a turn, Job responding each time. And we've gotten to the 3rd cycle, and Eliphaz went first, and then Job answered, and now it's Bildad's turn. And he gives us all of 6 verses. So the formal structure of the book would have called for a full response from Bildad here, and then a full response from Zophar after a rebuttal from Job. That's what the pattern really requires, but Zophar doesn't actually ever speak again. And Bildad's speech is just this, the 6 verses of theology that doesn't engage Job's argument at all. This 3rd cycle of the dialogue simply doesn't finish, and the formal debate collapses. I think about what this would look like from Job's perspective. He has spent chapters building a careful, specific case that the wicked prosper in this life without visible punishment, that God does not operate on a schedule of visible justice, and that the system his friends have been describing does not match the world as it actually exists. He ended with a direct challenge. He said, prove me wrong. And what he gets in response is the intellectual equivalent of a shrug. There's no counter argument. There's no rebuttal. It's just 6 verses of very general theology, and the conversation grinds to a halt. In a debate, this is what it looks like when somebody runs out of material. It's not because they've changed their mind, like Bildad still thinks that Job is wrong. He still thinks that Job needs to confess something, but he doesn't have an answer to what Job actually said, so he's retreating to a bit safer ground. So those opening lines, as we get into the argument itself, he says, dominion and awe belong to God. He establishes order in the heights of heaven. Can his forces be numbered? On whom does his light not rise? And you know what? There's nothing wrong with these opening verses as theology, because yes, God does have dominion. His armies are unable to be counted, right? They are innumerable. His light reaches everywhere. These are all true, and they're the kind of thing that people have been saying about God throughout the book, including Job himself. Back in chapter 9, Job spoke at length about God's power stretching from the mountains to the sea, setting the stars in their places, doing things too great to number and too wonderful to understand. But notice what Bildad doesn't do here. He's not engaging Job's argument about the wicked prospering. He doesn't even try to answer why the murderer in the dark keeps operating. He doesn't address the boundary stones being moved or the orphan's donkey being seized, or the dying, groaning in the city with no response from God. He's asserting God's power and sovereignty, full stop. But that's it. It's almost like answering, well, why is there suffering in the world with, well, God's very powerful. I mean, yeah, the statement is true, but it's not addressing the question. Well, he continues. He says, how then can a mortal be righteous before God? How can one born of a woman be pure? This question's come up before. Eliphaz asks something almost identical in chapter 4 in his very first speech. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? And it surfaced again in chapter 9 when Job himself wrestled with it honestly. It appeared again in chapter 15. This is not new ground, so Bildad is not developing the question or taking it somewhere the dialogue hasn't been. He's reaching for something that's already been said because, well, he doesn't really have anything else that looks like. And the question itself, again, isn't wrong. The gap between human beings and a holy God is absolutely real. The New Testament doesn't even dispute that. Romans 3 is quite clear that there is no one righteous, not even one. The question of how a person can be right before God is one of the most serious questions that the Bible actually takes up. But here's where the argument quietly fails. Job never claimed to be righteous in the absolute sense that Bildad seems to mean here. That means sinless, utterly pure, standing on God's level. What Job has claimed is that he is innocent of the specific things his friends have accused him of, and that his suffering isn't the deserved punishment for secret wickedness. Those are two different claims. Bildad is answering a question that Job didn't ask while ignoring the question that Job did. So there's a version of this that happens in real conversations where somebody raises a specific complaint. This particular thing doesn't seem fair. The situation seems unjust. And the response comes back at a completely different level of abstraction. Well, none of us is perfect. We all fall short. And yeah, that may be true, but it doesn't touch what was actually being said. Bildad has been doing some version of this since chapter 8, but here it's the whole speech. Then he finishes by saying, if even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less a mortal who is but a maggot, a human being who is only a worm. The moon and stars image is Bildad's way of building a scale, right? Like if even the glorious bodies of the heavens fall short of God's purity, then surely a human being can make no claim to righteousness at all. The argument moves from the cosmic to the personal, from what shines in the sky to what crawls in the dirt. And it lands on the maggot and the worm. Now, there is a strand of legitimate biblical humility that reaches for that kind of language. Psalm 22, a psalm we know as messianic, that Jesus himself quotes from the cross, opens with the voice of one who is suffering, saying, I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. That is a genuine expression of lowliness and abandonment, a person who's at the bottom. That language can be honest and real. But something else is going on here. The word translated maggot in verse 6 is the same Hebrew word Job used back in chapter 17 when he said his closest companions had become the worms of the grave. Job's been talking about his own physical decay. His body is covered in sores and festering wounds. And we know from chapter 7 that Job's flesh was literally clothed with worms. Bildad is using that word, the word for the actual creatures who are eating Job's body, and he's applying it to Job's moral and spiritual status before God. And whether or not Bildad intended the cruelty of that, it's hard to read it any other way. Job is sitting on an ash heap. He's covered with open sores. He's already spoken about worms in his own skin. And Bildad stands up, delivers these 6 verses, and the final 2 are telling this man that he is a maggot and a worm. And that's where his friends end their argument. Not with an argument, with an insult that wraps itself in theology. Now, there's something important that doesn't happen after Bildad stops talking. The book structure should require Zophar to speak after Job would respond, but he doesn't. This actually ends the 3rd cycle. Now, Job is going to speak and speak and speak all the way through chapter 31 without anybody interrupting him or challenging him. Job ended his challenge at the close of chapter 34, asking anybody to prove him wrong. Nobody takes him up on it. In the world of this book, that matters. It doesn't mean that Job has resolved his suffering, and it doesn't mean that his questions about God's justice have been answered. But his argument that the system of the visible, proportional, this life retribution his friends insisted on doesn't hold. It goes unanswered by the people who insisted on it most loudly. Bildad finishes speaking, and the debate, such as it was, is over. Next time, we're going to see how Job responds and how different his response is from anything the friends have offered so far. But we'll get that next time. Hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you again soon. God bless.